Okay, so once again, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us from, and welcome to this UbuntuNet Alliance Cloud webinar. I am Alex Matil from UbuntuNet Alliance.
So I'm Dave Haynes. I work for GEANT as the head of cloud services. GEANT is the pan-European research and education network, and we provide connectivity or interconnectivity to all of the European NRENs. We also provide global connectivity across to the US, South America. We are responsible for the delivery of the Africa Connect 3 project and all the related connectivity into the African region. I work closely with the Middle East. I work closely with Asia. But what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today is our experience in Europe in terms of the cloud landscape and global trends. I'm going to talk a little bit about what are commercial services, because what we're seeing very quickly is that cloud is not just infrastructure as a service. Cloud is, in fact, a lot more than infrastructure as a service, a lot of platform as a service, a lot of software as a service. We see the education and research community in Europe consuming more and more platform and software services. And if you just have a look at the diagram here, what we're seeing looking forward is the institutes are consuming NREN bandwidth. They're also consuming commercial bandwidth, and they're using software-defined wide area networking to make sure that their strategic workloads always have priority in terms of bandwidth. We're seeing less and less demand for on-premise data centers, and we're seeing more and more demand for everything consumable. So, for example, I was in Lisbon at a university 3 weeks ago, and they had procured Microsoft Azure to host their e-learning or LMS solution under the 2016 GEANT Cloud Framework. But within 2 years, they'd actually shut that service down, and they were consuming Blackboard out of the Blackboard cloud, so as a service. And what's really important is that if you consume software as a service, what you're consuming is actually bandwidth optimized. So a lot of the legacy applications shifted a lot of data they didn't need to be shifting. But when you're consuming software as a service, multi-tenant software as a service, it is bandwidth optimized. So obviously you need the bandwidth and you need the networks, but you are working with very effective solutions. One of the reasons that we're seeing more and more people consuming software as a service as opposed to consuming from legacy workloads, either on-premise or lifted and shifted into one of the cloud platforms, is that the rate of innovation is incredibly high. Cloud services allowed startups to start developing a service and slowly scale up and consume more and more cloud services as they deployed their services and their services were consumed. And what we're seeing in the research community in Europe is that PhD students are taking the tool sets that they created to complete their doctoral degrees, and they are able to commercialize these by deploying them on cloud platforms and making them available through cloud marketplaces, for example. So the rate of innovation based on competition is very, very high. So you're going to see that in terms of the enterprise, certainly, the functional development of your enterprise solution is not going to be giving you the strategic advantage it once did. And the multi-tenant software solutions are going to be evolving at a far more rapid rate. They're far easier to deploy, they're far easier to maintain, and they're far more sustainable. The European Commission, the UK government, the United States, Canada, the Japanese government, I work with a lot of their local NRENs, and they're all promoting a digital economy for research. They're all promoting consume, not build, where possible. Infrastructure or platform as a service underpinning the e-infra services. So even services that we provide at GEANT are now starting to be underpinned by AWS, for example, or Azure. The European Open Science Cloud, the sustainable core, is procured. It's all commercial infrastructure. And we're also promoting the development of the startups and the small, medium enterprises. As I said, often PhD students. I work closely with the Copernicus program in Europe, and often people who've consumed Copernicus data in terms of Earth observations are able to create a tool set consuming that data and deploy it as a commercial consumable service very easily. There is a huge green regional compute initiative in Europe, where Europe wants far fewer data centers. They don't want to see people building data centers. As I said, the rate of innovation is incredibly high. We're looking at HPC supplementation. So, for example, the University of Bath in the UK has just shrunk their physical HPC, high performance compute center. And what they're allowing their researchers to do is burst out into the cloud and consume hyperscale compute as and when they need it. So they don't have to maintain any kind of redundancy. They don't have to maintain this great big huge center. Their researchers can simply consume hyperscale compute. Fair data within Europe and globally, we look at the fair storage of archived research data available for other researchers. Fair means findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And the problem has always been, well, how does a researcher standardize the metadata that describes his research data? And there are a number of tools. There are tools on Azure, for example, Purview, that actually deep mine the data and allow the researcher to simply generate standardized metadata, and then which stays online, but the actual big data workloads go into cold storage and are kept available at 24, 36 hours notice, but in a very, very inexpensive way. And then the European Open Science Cloud is looking at white labeling commercial services. So, for example, if researchers come to EOSC, they may well be able to consume what looks like EOSC compute, but it will simply be a white labeled service. Can I carry on? Then if we look at the last 2.5 years since COVID hit, schools globally went online within the period of a week. They started consuming Moodle, Blackboard, Teams, Zoom to be able to teach their students remotely. The use of content repositories, virtual classrooms, communications, all of those were cloud-based services. And even in parts of the world where there's limited bandwidth, you know, I've traveled through a lot of institutes in Africa. I worked for a big research institute in Africa. And the students, the researchers, and the academics tend to at least have a smartphone. And because these services are all bandwidth optimized, they consume fairly little bandwidth, and they have brought everybody online. Research, we find collaboration forums using similar tools as we described in online learning. We find a lot of data sharing. And then we find a lot of platform as a service and software as a service tooling and support of machine learning and AI, so commercialized algorithms through predominantly the hyperscale platforms, but also some of the smaller cloud providers in Europe have marketplaces with these tools on them. If you look at some of the services, we see a lot of HIPAA certified health lakes. So there's a lot of support for the storage of health data in a very, very secure way. So your data centers have to be HIPAA certified to be able to store health data. But we're seeing a lot of that kind of service where it's actually, although it's storage, it's actually storage as pairs, a kind of a bespoke value-added platform for the storing of specific data. We're seeing JSTOR and Google Scholar. JSTOR use AWS, but these are all cloud-enabled. They are no longer deployed on premise, and they are accessible as software as a service. We see things like next generation sequencing for large data sets. You know, you can easily configure those. Deep learning containers, you know, you can easily configure those on Azure. Jupyter Notebooks as a service. We have a number of institutes that are simply deploying Jupyter Notebooks on a Google VM and consuming Jupyter Notebooks as a service. Moodle as a service. Moodle has now, even though they are open source, they've partnered with a commercial cloud partner, and you can consume the Moodle functionality as a service. Cirrus Identity. So there are a lot of focus services on this community, research and education, that can simply be consumed as a service. So although we're not talking about infrastructure as a service specifically, we're still talking about cloud. Okay, on the Okra project, which I've spoken about a number of times and many of you may have heard about, the Okra project was essentially a European project that I am the director of. We created a pan-European framework across 40 countries, which allows the institutes in each one of those 40 countries to find a supplier of Azure, AWS, Google, Orange, Cloud Sigma, a whole host of European platforms. But the competition between the suppliers of that platform has been done in that country. So we have 473 framework contracts that the institutes can use. And when the institute signs a call of contract under Okra with a supplier, the call of contract is then governed by the laws of their own country. So it's a really interesting construct. I would definitely do a focused presentation on the use of frameworks and the benefit to the NRENs in terms of relevance and their institutes at some point. But what the project also does is it made €9 million available to drive the adoption of these services. And in my first call out to the institutes in Europe, these are the kinds of research projects I got: oncological pet data, galactic research, human-machine collaboration. A lot of these projects are looking for hyperscale compute or storage, but they are also looking for very specific machine learning platforms and algorithms and some really interesting stuff off of the marketplaces, which they can easily consume through the Okra framework. But in this case, we are actually funding. On the right-hand side, we also set up it's a non-formal framework because a lot of the procurements of Earth observation services are well within the 50 to 200,000 euro bands in terms of European procurement. So you don't actually need a formal framework to support that. But I've also awarded Earth observation services to the project that you see on the right here. And these are all in countries across Europe. Data protection and sovereignty. So one of the key questions that is always asked in this kind of a webinar, but that the institutes ask anyway, is what about data protection? What about data sovereignty? And my answer is always the same. If you're consuming software or platform as a service, it is up to the supplier to fully secure your data under huge penalty. The suppliers of cloud services, infrastructure as a service, platform, and software as a service, they all have their own massive networks. They all have SOCs, security operations centers, with an incredible capacity for threat surveillance and response. So your data tends to be a lot more secure in a cloud data center than it could possibly ever be in an on-premise data center at an institute. If we look at the ERP consumed as SaaS, the multi-tenant SaaS providers like Workday, they have to protect your data under penalty of law. The productivity suites on the global cloud, learning management platforms like Blackboard, they have to protect your data. We spoke a little bit about the Research Data Alliance globally, fair data storage, research archival. There are protection mechanisms on all of those platforms to protect the data. The institutes must still ensure that personal data is encrypted the way the data would be encrypted in an on-premise data center. And certainly you have initiatives like POPI in your region and GDPR in Europe that actually govern what data is considered personal data and how it can be encrypted. And all of the cloud platforms own dual key encryption, where the first key is provided by the platform and the second key you can configure yourself. So you still have to take ownership for the way in which your data is stored. The institutes must still configure their own virtual OS network firewalls to ensure compliance, data integrity, authentication, network traffic protection. I mean, the institute needs to take responsibility for all of that. But the point is that your data is no less protected in on a commercial cloud platform. Okay, what we talked to the NRENs about in terms of what are the opportunities for the NRENs in supporting cloud services, compliance, so assisting with the verification of the service. In OCRA, one of the OCRA consortium partners was CERN in Europe, and CERN had developed a test suite and took standardized research workloads and tested each of the platforms, including the hyperscale platforms, to see how they performed regarding standardized research workloads. And although in terms of the competitive nature of procurement, we weren't able to make the results of that testing public, we were able to at least indicate that the platforms had been successfully tested. So there's the verification of service. There is the support of the regional and national regulations and data sovereignty. You know, unpacking, the NREN can actually unpack what your national government requires in terms of checkbox, in terms of data sovereignty, and make sure that the suppliers are compliant. SURF in the Netherlands, the NREN in the Netherlands, works very closely with all of the big commercial providers to ensure that the terms and conditions that the institutes sign are actually in line with local laws in terms of data protection. So the NREN can really play a role there. Data routing analysis to ensure that there's no latency in the networks, to also to negotiate with any commercial provider of any service, be it infrastructure, platform, or software as a service, that there's data ingress and egress waivers, so that the institute is not paying for data traffic on the providers' networks. And we obviously did that through the OCRA framework in Europe. Trust, identity, and security. In OCRA, we made sure that all platforms supported SAML2 or OIDC protocols. We onboarded most of the commercial providers onto EduGAIN, which is the GEANT Federation. And again, we also made sure that the threat surveillance and response on these networks was optimum. So NRENs like JISC, who are very well resourced, NRENs within the ASREN region have their own SOCs. So they do a lot of monitoring on the NREN's own networks. So that's also something that the NREN can provide the institutes in terms of just, safely consuming these services. And then as a community, certainly working with Africa Connect, working with UbuntuNet, WACREN, ASREN, and all of the NRENs across Europe, we facilitate a lot of supplier training and webinars, and the suppliers are only too happy to do this. In fact, under the OCRA framework contracts, the suppliers are obliged to do three webinars in each of the countries every year in terms of the support of their services. Procurement frameworks, again, as I said, ensuring that the institutes can easily procure these services, that competitions have taken place, that if an institute needs a specific service from Microsoft, they can go to a single supplier of Microsoft in country and simply procure on a call-off because the competition has taken place. And, as I said, I'd be very happy to do a focused workshop on this with our procurement and legal experts in Europe to help you look at what an Africa Connect type framework could look like. Best pricing as a community, you can aggregate demand, and as a community, you can actually demand that you get the best pricing, that you get the best terms and conditions, and that you're able to kind of support the resultant contracts. And I think that's really, really important. So I think that's all I was going to talk about. This, what we're seeing on Okra is that the Okra IS Plus framework is showing 120% year-on-year growth. And by the end of 2022, we will be consuming the institutes in Europe will be consuming 80 million euros worth of cloud through the Okra framework. By the end of 2023, that will be at 200 million. As I say, we're seeing the kind of shift from infrastructure as a service slowly towards platform and software as a service, but it's all cloud and it's all considered consumption. And we do measure that. We're able to dashboard for each of the NRENs in Europe what their local institutes are consuming, so that they can report on their own trends to their local governments, to their own CEOs. We have a cloud managers forum here in Europe, which we would be very happy to extend invitations to other regions to, or help set up regionally focused cloud groups to be able to present on webinars or workshops like this one,